Welcome back to Crosstabs. I'm your host, Farrah Bostic. Many years ago, I was just starting out as a brand strategist at a great creative agency in the city, and I was working on audience research for, among other clients, the Sci-Fi Channel. We'd been handed some quantitative audience segmentation research at the start of the project, and it seemed pretty strange to me. It really defined this very narrow set of people as being interested in science fiction and fantasy content, a group of people that just was not big enough to sustain, let's say, The Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Star Trek, Harry Potter, The X-Files, comic books, the Terminator series, the Alien movies, video games, and so on. One of the reasons for that result, though, was that there was this application of identity inside the questionnaire flow. They were asked, do you consider yourself to be a sci-fi fan? So at the time, this is like 2002, 2003, something like that. At the time, most people still saw the phrase sci-fi fan and pictured like some guy playing video games in his mother's basement. It was not aspirational. You have to understand, video games weren't mainstream cool yet. Startup founders weren't the cool kids. Iron Man hadn't come out yet. Being a nerd simply was not cool. So when we started our project, we went the other direction. We started by asking people what their favorite movies were. We asked them if they watched shows like The X-Files or Star Trek or Buffy, or if they liked M. Night Shyamalan movies or The Matrix. Then we would ask if they considered themselves sci-fi fans. I still remember one person filling out this diary that we gave them. They had to do a list of their favorite movies, and their list included Star Wars movies, Terminator movies, at least 2 of them, Back to the Future, at least 2 of them, Harry Potter, Gattaca, and a couple of others that I can't remember now whether they were sci-fi movies or not. But the point was something like 8 out of the 10 that they listed were clearly sci-fi fantasy movies. But when we asked them if they thought of themselves as a sci-fi fan, they said no. So it turns out that there are a lot of things that work like this, that we align ourselves with or reject these kinds of identities or these positions in the abstract. And then when you start to get specific, all of a sudden those alignments change. You're not willing to call yourself a sci-fi fan, but you love sci-fi. In politics, we see this play out over and over again on everything from taxes to trade policy to immigration to race to the social safety net to public health to abortion. People will identify as a partisan on the issue in the abstract. But as you start to get into the specifics of the issue, you start to see that identity for what it really is: abstract. It's not concrete. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately as we start to see deeper dives on specific issues like immigration and abortion is that there's a line from William Gibson about how the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And the thing about public opinion is it too is not evenly distributed. And it's not evenly distributed across voters, and it's also not evenly distributed within the issue set. So you can have someone who identifies as pro-life, but is also in favor of abortion being legal under most circumstances. You can have someone who identifies as pro-choice, but also thinks there should be limits on the availability of abortion under certain circumstances. So I have a guest today that helps me dive in to the nuances of these kinds of questions. As she put it in a recent Substack post, she wrote, "In reality, most voters are partisans but not ideologues. They play for a political team, but their views across specific issues are often inconsistent, malleable, and even contradictory. For this reason, what is and isn't popular is highly dependent on framing and context." She goes on to write that, quote, "Public opinion is not a one-way street from voters' hearts to elected officials' ears. It's a conversation between elites and the mass public that often flows in the opposite direction. What's popular is hugely dependent on whether and how political leaders choose to own and frame an issue." Her name is Lauren Goldstein. She holds a PhD from UCLA and has 10 years of experience as a public opinion researcher and social scientist. She has done extensive research and polling on issues related to racial justice and injustice, criminal legal reform and police divestment, immigration, and reproductive rights. She is also an analyst at Change Research. She writes about these nuanced relationships people have with their own opinions and with elite influence for her personal Substack, Mind the Gap. She recently wrote a piece called Actually Abortion Isn't Polarizing on her Substack that I found incredibly insightful for connecting with people on issues both through relatable specifics, but also through shared values. So we sat down recently to talk about her analysis of abortion in particular, but also how this same analysis applies across a host of other issues. And she offers some really good advice for political strategists and communicators, or even just people trying to have a conversation with a friend or family member or a neighbor they don't seem to agree with. While she does reference Change Research methods and findings in our conversation, however, her Substack is her own. Here is our conversation. Hope you enjoy it. So, first of all, just thank you for responding to my totally cold outreach in response to your excellent post on Substack. I want to start, though, Lauren, by getting a sense of just your background, how you came to this work, and a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, sure thing. So I got started in public opinion research about a decade ago, and I came to it via academia. So I completed my PhD in psychology. I actually got my start polling at Change Research in the last year of graduate school.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And part of what drew me to polling is I sort of thought, here's a way to apply my skills in a much more direct way, to have more of an impact on things I was passionate about. But I also felt like there were so many shortcomings in the polling world and how we tended to interpret polls or see polling numbers that had to do with very surface level questions. And that's also what led me to Change Research, because I just saw that they were coming at public opinion in a really different way than what I think the rest of the industry was doing. They were really innovative, really creative. And I thought, well, that's where I would like to go. So I trained as a political psychologist, which is this like interdisciplinary subfield of social psychology and political science. And my focus in all of my work and all of my training was in this school of what's called symbolic politics. So symbolic politics theory is this idea that our political attitudes and beliefs and behaviors are rooted in symbols, emotions, values, beliefs, not these sort of detached, agnostic, ultra rational calculations of costs and benefits to voting for certain things. So like partisanship is a really good example of that, right? One of the most important predictors of how someone's going to conduct themselves politically. Partisanship is not really a collection of policy preferences. It's more of a social identity. It's an affective attachment. It sort of operates like a religious identity. It's this guiding framework for how a person can make sense of the world, form beliefs, make decisions.
Can I interject here and just ask a question about that? Because I spent the week last week with my boomer mother, who was sort of saying, she does not have that kind of closely held identity with, she's been a member of either party, of both parties rather, over the course of her voting life. And like, she just kind of doesn't identify with the identity component of it. Has it always been this way, or is that something that has kind of emerged or crystallized or kind of become more pronounced over time?
Yeah, this general approach to understanding how partisanship operates is definitely not new. Dates back to research that sort of got started in the 50s, I would say, with the seminal American voter. Not everyone is a partisan, but most people are. So we do have that unattached middle that's somewhere between 10 and 14% probably of the electorate. For those people, partisanship is not a strong identity. They're not sort of bought in on one party, but most people are. And for them, that is generally how partisanship functions. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a super closely held identity that's central to their self-concept. The point is more that we're not these like ultra rational, very sort of clinical, detached, rational beings walking around, interpreting policies, writing them down, calculating our personal cost benefit, and then making decisions about what to vote for on the basis of that. Right. It's much more affective and it's much more symbolic than that.
That's super interesting. What do you think, maybe talk a bit about what you think Change does differently from other pollsters in this space? I think it's an interesting kind of observation that as somebody who does not do political polling myself, I'm frequently, I think I said this in our one of our pre-calls, like the handful of times I have done political research, it has struck me as strange methodologically. Like it's just not how I would explore any other kind of brand or any other kind of behavior that people engage in. And so I'm curious about what you saw as being kind of odd about about the industry overall, and what drew you to change research.
Yeah, absolutely. So change is different than pretty much everybody else, I think, in the industry for a couple of reasons. One having to do with our sampling methodology, and then more broadly, just in terms of how we approach public opinion research conceptually. So methods wise, we do all of our surveys online, but what makes us different is we don't use panels, which is what other online providers are using. So we recruit a fresh sample into every poll rather than relying on this panel of people who've opted in to take surveys generally. And we reach them in two ways. We place targeted ads on websites and on social media in the corresponding geography of where we're trying to reach people. And we also use the voter file to do text to web. So we can take anybody who's got a cell phone on the voter file and we can text them, a invitation to make their thoughts heard. Right. We don't pay people to take our surveys. We just, offer the invitation to participate. So we're doing it differently than everybody else in terms of how we're reaching people. And we find that that's particularly useful in reaching some of those traditionally harder to reach groups that tend to be underrepresented in phone polling. Younger voters, voters of color, lower propensity voters that are not super bought into the political process. So that's our methodological approach. And then our more conceptual approach is really sort of pushing public opinion data to go below the surface, go beyond asking the same old questions, and take on some topics with creativity. We often refer to polling as a listening tool. So our origin story, Change Research was founded in the wake of the 2016 election. So part of our mission is to kind of challenge the status quo of public opinion research, make it more dynamic, more creative, more accessible. So we do that in a lot of ways. We ask open-ended questions in our polls that allow us to capture not just someone's position on the issue, but really the why behind it, or their interpretations of what's at stake, or how a certain policy might change their lives. So in a lot of ways, we're kind of pushing the boundaries of traditional public opinion research, trying to make it more accurate, yes, but also more useful and actionable for forward-thinking candidates and causes.
And this seems like a thing that has come up over time. You've seen other, Pew occasionally will do this, where they'll do a deep dive on a particular topic and start to pull apart people's attitudes towards immigration or taxes or any number of policy areas. But I think even before we get into the specific post that made me reach out to you, I'm curious about this. I think one of the other components of the issue of, how rational are voters, how much are they taking on, particular policy positions, going through a sense-making process about what those policy positions would mean for them, and how much are they engaged in this more kind of symbolic activity. I just want to acknowledge something. I had a conversation with Professor Cindy Kam about a similar kind of topic of just like the reality is like we live in a complicated, complex world, and we have theoretically a system of government that is intended for us to essentially delegate to representatives the job of that deliberation and sense making and fact finding. And they are in many respects really there to represent our values and our personal, our address the needs of the nation, but certainly address the values and preferences of their voters. But it's not my job to sit on, the Aerospace Committee and listen to all the testimony and read all of the briefs and then make a decision about how I'm going to vote, because I don't actually get to vote on any of the policy positions. I'm just voting for a candidate. So I want to kind of dial in on that. There is a reason for it to be symbolic, for it to be not down in the depths of the details. And that's like, ain't nobody got time for that. In addition to the fact that we are emotional creatures and we process everything emotionally. But I wanted to kind of just put that point on it. I am curious then about how you get beyond the kind of traditional polling questions about like which of these topics is the most important to you in the upcoming election. And it's just like single word or short phrase descriptions of a policy area where we ask a question that's like, who do you trust more on this issue or that issue, the Republicans or the Democrats, this candidate or that candidate? And again, they're rolled up into single word, like, who do I trust more on immigration? Well, I guess it depends on which version of immigration I'm thinking about right now, right? So maybe talk about how you go about. I love the open-ended part of this as a qualitative researcher, but maybe you can talk a bit about question design and how you think through how to put these questions to folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're touching on is kind of a central complaint that I have sometimes about polling when it doesn't go below the surface, and part of what I'm so proud of what we do at Change. So if you take, for example, the question of political violence and concerns about political violence, what we've seen in some surveys is there's something of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans who express concerns about this or who might express, some degree of support for it under necessary circumstances. Similar pattern happens when you ask about like threats to democracy. When you couch it in these really vague terms, you're going to get everybody saying the same thing for very different reasons. They're projecting really different symbolic beliefs and concerns onto this question. So it's not to say that that question is not useful as a starting place, because we often, we'll talk about how we design a survey. You sort of want it to go from lowest hanging fruit to toughest questions to answer or grapple with, because you want to warm people up a little bit. And you do want to open with something a little bit broad, but then you kind of have an imperative to follow up with more specific targeted questions. What is it exactly that you're worried about? Which of these threats to democracy are you most concerned with, and allowing people to pick more than one? Making sure that the way that you design the question answers doesn't indicate to a respondent that there's a right answer to the question. And also making sure, if you are trying to understand a breadth of public opinion on an issue where you know that partisans are bringing really different priors to the topic, you want to make sure that the answer options that you give them sound like them. You want to use their words. I'll confess, I got a lot of polling solicitations last year via text for text to web polls from a Republican Senate campaign. And I took the polls. I was super curious, and nothing about their screening screened me out. So I thought, hey, I'm allowed to be here. Right. And all of the questions were just so clearly Republican coded. Questions about border security and making sure that we're safe from illegal immigrants. It's all language that is so clearly partisan, that's tipping me off as a survey taker about who's behind the poll. And also tipping me off that they are clearly kind of pushing me in a certain direction with my answers. And that as a survey taker makes it clear to you, you're not really interested in what I think. You are interested in ending up with an answer pattern that serves your purposes. So one of the things that we're mindful of is making sure that we are really accurately capturing what people think and why they think it in language that is accessible to them and that feels organic to their beliefs, and not something that immediately tips them off that there's either a right answer to your question or a really obvious ideological bent to the purpose of the survey.
This is something we talk about. Paul, who's part of my team that handles all of the quant design, we collaborate really heavily on it because his orientation, he's from New Zealand, so I think comes from a slightly different tradition of survey design than a lot of American market researchers. We don't do quant first. We have to talk to people to make sure we're talking about, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be soft drinks. It could be sneakers. It's you have to know what the words they use to describe these things are, and giving them even like a battery of, I was reading a column today where a researcher had offered a 7-point or 7 attribute list, 7 emotions list to describe how people were feeling about the current administration. And I was kind of like, okay, but how did you come up with the array of emotions? Like, did you and maybe she did, I don't know, but maybe she gathered that from focus group feedback and hearing people's own words for it. But a lot of times in my experience on the commercial side, it's just made up. It's like feelings we think they might have, feelings we want them to have. And maybe sometimes you have like the feelings I want them to have and then the opposite. And so that way we can kind of get a sense of how far from our desired emotional response we are. But I think that time taken to actually use the language of the people that you are surveying, give them the sense that they should respond as they feel, not as you're kind of priming them to feel. And I think that this is also the kind of Cosmo quiz experience sometimes, right? Where you can kind of guess what the good answer is, or you can figure out, if it's a dated reference, Sex and the City, which Sex and the City character are you? Like, you can decide which one do you want to be. Do you want to be Samantha or do you want to be Miranda? And you can answer all A's or all B's in order to get that response. And I think this is a really interesting observation that when you get these polls, and I was getting them too. I live in Suffolk County, so I was getting lots of polls last cycle, and I could tell when they were coming from. In the primary season, I could tell which candidate they were coming from on the Democratic side. In the general election, I could tell whether it was coming from Nick LaLota or John Avlon. It was just plain as day. Mm-hmm. And I could tell when it wasn't either one of them, when it was the person who was running for state assembly. But like, and sometimes it was like, I didn't even know what they were talking about. Like, they were talking about a very specific policy area or a very specific program in the county that is in the western side of the county, so I wouldn't experience it ever. You're asking me to respond to things I don't know what you're talking about. And also I can tell that you are framing, like you say, border security tells you something about the orientation of the question versus immigration even, which is a neutral and too broad of a term. But that's a super interesting approach to things, of like, first start with how do people actually talk about stuff and try to design the questionnaire accordingly. I guess one question I have for you is also going back to this, feels like it intersects with the decision not to use panels, which is like people who are on panels are being polled frequently, especially during election cycles. And it seems like they would be kind of experts in detecting what are you driving at? What answer are you trying to get? And I was talking to someone. I was skeeting. Is that what we say on Blue Sky? Skeeting with someone yesterday so. about are we polling people so frequently and in these kind of not true to the way they think about things way so much that now even their own relationship to their opinions when they respond to a survey are kind of detached. Like, they're not thinking about it deeply. They're just kind of getting through the survey, get those e-rewards points or whatever at the end of the thing. Just get it done. I mean, I know, again, my boomer mother loves to sit on the sofa and take YouGov polls when she's bored. Like, it's just kind of, she thinks it's interesting. But part of what she's doing is trying to figure out, why are you asking? Like, to her, it's a little puzzle, not just like her. So I don't know how much she's answering her genuine beliefs about things, but this is a really interesting sort of set of decisions to try to get closer to people's actual mental models, their actual kind of symbols that they apply to these things, and use the language of the voter as opposed to the language of the partisan who's trying to persuade them. I think that's a really interesting and refreshing approach to political polling. I don't think you see a ton of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of what drew me to change research in the first place, and part of what I love about our approach. And I should also note, we do more than polling at Change. Mm-hmm. We also do qualitative research in addition to just asking some open-ended questions in our quantitative instruments. So we do that in two ways. We call them our voices offerings. Mm-hmm. So we do chats, which are text message based open-ended questions. So we will pose them to people and they can answer them at a time that's convenient to them. Mm-hmm. And then we also do in-depth interviews, or IDIs, where we do a longer form video chat interview with somebody, where we can really dig in below the surface and avoid some of the difficulties around groupthink that sometimes come up in a focus group setting. So we're definitely coming at this in multiple ways. I would say that, the order of operations changes sometimes. We don't always begin with qual, but sometimes qual can be a really helpful way of checking your priors on something that you thought was working or that you thought would work for every audience. And then you delve in a little bit more deeply with a specific group of people and you realize, actually, they're thinking about this slightly differently. And there's a thing I was inadvertently doing that was putting them off of this communication strategy. And if we just make this change, they're a lot more on board with it. Yeah. So qual has a really important place in our research practice as well.
Yeah, I think it can also be really helpful sorry, at some point we will like just go get a drink and talk about qual. No, I'm kidding. Because we did a project that this past fall, I've talked about it before, I think, on the show, where we asked as a screener question. It was an articulation question. It was an open end, and it was something about like the category was soft drinks. And so we were asking people like, what's your first memory of like a non-alcoholic drink you really loved? And we used that phrase, non-alcoholic drink, not really thinking about how widespread non-alcoholic has become in describing the category of mocktails and virgin drinks and non-alcoholic beer and wine. And so about half of the respondents talked about, 6 months ago, the first time I tried athletic brewing or something like that. And at first, as we're going through the screeners, we were like, oh, this person didn't understand the question, kick them out, like kick them out. And then we realized, oh, no, there's so many of them. So this phrase has entered the commercial culture to mean something that doesn't just mean drinks that don't have alcohol in them. And it was a real lesson for us that when we then went out into field work, we needed to talk about things as juices, waters, soft drinks, as opposed to non-alcoholic beverages, because we were just going to send people off in the direction of, a can of Gia, whatever, to make their mock Negronis. So it's a really, really important thing to do. And I think sometimes it's also good to do it after you've done quant, where you see a result and you're like, I don't know why they answered this way. And getting back into a conversation with people can make you understand, they interpreted the question in a way that I didn't intend, or this is load bearing and has a whole bunch of meaning resting on top of it that we didn't anticipate going into the study. So I'm just going to foot stomp that. Yes, I think that's a great idea. What drove you to start your own Substack?
Yeah, I felt that there were so many aspects of the public narrative and discourse around what is and isn't popular with voters that felt built on misguided notions of how public opinion works, how we measure it, and how voters think. So it sort of developed as something of like a myth-busting passion project of mine, to try to bring more context into how public opinion works and how voters' minds work, to make that conversation a bit more accurate in my mind. So I should note, I'm a pollster with Change Research, but the Substack that I write is a personal endeavor of mine that's unaffiliated. And I was just so struck by the plethora of pieces post-election about what is and isn't popular with voters, and what elected officials should be doing to respond to that reality, that I just felt was a misrepresentation fundamentally of where the public is actually at on a lot of these issues, that reflects some surface level lack of excavation into what's really going on in voters' minds and hearts.
Maybe we can take then as an example this piece that you wrote about how abortion is popular, actually, and kind of how you explored that topic and broke it down a little bit, because I think for most of my life, the sort of story was, I think, encapsulated in that kind of Clintonian position of safe, legal, and rare. And that embedded in that idea was, yes, it should be legal, but not all the time. And actually people don't like it. And it's really unpopular, except in this small group of people for whom it's super unpopular single issue voter. It's super popular single issue voter. And then everybody in the middle is just kind of uncomfortable with the whole idea. And so, we will moderate our abortion positions accordingly. But then, like, you get into actual conversations with people about their actual feelings about these things, setting aside the statistics on how many women, actually have to get abortion care at some point in their lives, which suggests that, whatever their opinion about it might be, their lived experience may be something else. But maybe just talk a bit about how you get underneath that kind of top level, are you for it or are you against it, kind of polling method, even the kind of fairly technical questions about, like, how many weeks along should you be before we ban it? Like, that also seems like a lot of people don't know what any of that even means. So, like half the population doesn't really know what any of that means. So, so how do you get underneath that topic to start to figure out how people practically feel about a topic like abortion that is so fraught?
Yeah. I mean, what I find through my research is that this narrative of polarization around this topic is really only true when you begin and end with a simple question like, are you pro-choice or pro-life?
Mm.
When you dig under the surface, you find that the American public is overwhelmingly in favor of abortion rights in almost every circumstance where someone might elect to have one or medically need one, but they wouldn't describe themselves that way. So when you give people a question like, are you pro-choice or pro-life? You're inviting people to sort themselves by labels, by symbolic political terms and values. So the most recent figure I have on that type of question comes from a Gallup poll from last year. And what that poll showed is 54% of Americans would call themselves pro-choice and 41% would call themselves pro-life. And there's that 5% that have no opinion. So those binary labels paint a picture of a pretty divided public, right? Narrowly in favor of abortion rights, as you described, but it's fraught.
Mm-hmm.
If you go deeper, the story starts to change. So we dug into this in a recent poll we did in January at Change Research, a national poll of registered voters. So just starting out one level deeper than that pro-choice, pro-life question, we asked people, do you think abortion should be legal in all cases, legal in some cases, or most cases, excuse me, illegal in most cases, or illegal in all cases? 61% say that it should be legal in most or all cases, collapsing those two options. 33% illegal in most or all cases. So for folks who follow public opinion on this issue, those numbers are probably very familiar. This is an incredibly stable finding year over year, decade over decade. And it's hard to achieve 61% agreement on most things these days. But if you go even a little bit deeper, it's actually a much stronger consensus than 61%. So the next thing we ask them after the legal illegal question is ask them to sort themselves into one of these three categories. I personally support a woman's right to an abortion and believe it should be legal and available. That's the one that we sort of associate with the pro-choice position. I am personally against abortion, but I do not believe government should prevent a woman from making that decision for herself. And I personally believe having an abortion is wrong and should be illegal is our third option. So 47% of voters sort themselves into that first category. I'm personally in favor of these rights. I think they should be legal and available. Another 33% say that they're personally against it, but don't believe that the government should make it illegal, should be making that decision for other people. So that's 80% when you combine those two positions, because both of those effectually are a pro-choice position, right? Regardless of your personal feelings on the topic, it should be legal and it should be somebody's personal decision whether they have one or not. Right. So only 20% of voters believe in the abstract that abortion should be illegal. So we've gone from 61% to 80%. 80-20 on an issue is a landslide already in terms of public consensus. But if you can believe it, even that 20% is overstated when you dig in a little bit more deeply. So what we did next in the poll is give people a list of circumstances where someone might need or want to get an abortion and ask them to rate whether they thought abortion should be legal or illegal in each of those cases. So those included some medical context circumstances, like if the mother's health is at risk or if the pregnancy isn't viable. They also include some circumstances that are just defined by how many weeks into a pregnancy they had. 6 weeks, 15 weeks. So what we find is that the majority of American voters think that abortion should be legal in every single circumstance that we tested, except one. After 24 weeks, if there's no medical emergency or fatal fetal abnormality. It is hard for me to even explain in words or numbers how vanishingly rarely that happens. So abortions after fetal viability, which is 24 weeks-ish, is what, 1% of all abortions? The vast majority of that 1% is happening because of a fatal fetal abnormality or a medical emergency that puts the mother's life at risk, which voters support. So basically the only type of abortion that the American public doesn't think should be legal is the type that is already practically non-existent. It's so rare. In case all of that is not enough, took it one step further, looked again at all of those answer patterns on all of those individual circumstances, but restricted our lens to only looking at the answer patterns among the people who earlier in the survey said abortion should be illegal in most or all cases. So now we're giving them the cases. Even those voters support legal abortion, a majority support legal abortion in almost every circumstance that we tested. They only withhold support when we frame the circumstances in terms of how far into a pregnancy they happen, 6 weeks,
Mm.
15 weeks, instead of presenting context around how they're medically necessary or they're a response to a criminal act. So even the people who say that they believe abortion should be illegal in most cases actually support the right to a legal abortion in the majority of cases that we tested.
Hmm.
So why is it the case that so many people sort themselves in this pro-life camp when they seems like they're actually in favor of legal abortion in most circumstances? I would say the answer comes back to symbolic politics because these labels are super moralized and they leave a lot of room for people to project. So what we've seen anti-abortion rights groups do strategically is drum up a really inflated perception of how frequently people are having abortions later in pregnancy,
Hmm.
electively.
Hmm.
So one of the last questions we asked in this poll about abortion was on that topic. We asked people to give their best guess as to what percent of abortions in the US happen in the first 13 weeks of pregnancy, roughly the first trimester. So we gave them four possible answers. 45% of abortions in the US happen in the first 13 weeks, 58%, 76%, or 94%. So what percent would you guess is the right answer? Like what percent of abortions in the US happen in the first 13 weeks of pregnancy? The answer is 94%.
Hmm.
94% of abortions are happening in that first 13 weeks. So how many people got that question right? 15% of our poll takers got that right,
Hmm.
which means 85% of American voters considerably overestimate what percent of abortions are happening later in pregnancy. So my suspicion is that people who would call themselves pro-life in a survey or who would say in a survey that abortion should be illegal in most cases are probably conjuring those examples as
Hmm.
prototypical and they're defining themselves symbolically against it.
Hmm. I think this is exceptionally interesting given some of the other kind of things in the headlines lately where you have people who abstractly support, defunding USAID. And then you ask them, well, how much money do you think of the federal budget goes to supporting international aid and development around the world? And they will wildly overestimate. Frequently they'll say things like 10% of the federal budget goes to that. And of course, it's not, it's like 1%, less than 1%. Um, and so a lot of this I wonder about in kind of two directions. And one is there is sort of this public discourse that is being driven by partisans who have an interest in for particular policy outcomes, and so they are framing the conversation in a particular way. And then I think there are also just kind of like latent models people are using for evaluating things. And so, I think one of the things that operates on the USAID question is this we're not doing enough to help people at home perspective, which of course is used by the people who are against international aid funding, but is also like, I think in some respects a kind of legit feeling of a lot of people in the United States that like whatever kind of domestic support policies we have, any kind of social safety net, doesn't actually apply to a lot of people, or they aren't aware of how it does apply to them. And so they just have this idea of like, I'd rather that, we heard the same thing during, the forever wars and during Vietnam and other things of like you are spending all of this money and resource and blood and treasure over here and we need it at home. And so that becomes the filter by which I respond to questions about international aid. I'm not thinking about tuberculosis and I'm not thinking about babies with HIV and I'm not thinking about, fistulas and whatever. Like I'm not thinking about actual people with actual health needs in actual places where it would be far better for us to help than not help. And I wonder if there's a similar kind of thing that's happening of like the default conception of a woman getting an abortion is a woman who doesn't want a baby and not actually like all these other cases where, and we had to learn about those post Dobbs. We had to learn about all the women who desperately wanted that baby, but needed abortion care and could not get it post whatever it was, SB6 or whatever in Texas. And then after, obviously, the Dobbs decision, it just opened the aperture for a little while of what people think abortion is for. And so in that kind of like, well, I don't think that pardon my framing of this, but like slutty young women who made bad choices should be able to get away with it. Like that kind of frame does seem to be part of it, certainly the way some people talk about it. I'm curious about how, like, what's the chicken and the egg there? Is it our classic two-step flow of like elites send a message to message purveyors and then the message purveyors spread it out? Is it people are already kind of coming to bringing some sort of moral conception of the world as a filter and then hearing messages that reinforce or contradict their filter? How do you think people are forming these abstracted opinions at that high level that give us this sense that maybe it's not that popular?
I think it's an all of the above. Public opinion is a feedback loop between mass public and political elites. It is not 100% a grassroots process, which is another thing that I think sometimes our discourse gets a little bit wrong. When it comes to what is and isn't popular, a huge piece of that equation is what political elites are doing to own the issue, care about the issue, and frame and communicate the issue to people. So the extent to which political elites are modeling this position on abortion of safe, legal, and rare is meant to be a reflection of public sentiment, but has a ton of power to shape public sentiment at the same time. So it's definitely a both in terms of which way public opinion flows, depending on whether you are the elite side of the equation or the mass public side of the equation. But also, people are drawing on a lot of symbolic moral codes given to them in large part through their partisan lens. It's sort of like rose-colored goggles for interpreting the world. I suppose rose or blue-colored goggles, depending on your lens.
Yeah.
And, you know, people are drawing on symbolic attachments and symbolic values most of the time when evaluating political positions and political options. So if you feel a great sense of conviction about when an abortion is and isn't acceptable, that is drawing on some punitive predispositions about it's appropriate under these circumstances and not under these circumstances, having everything to do with, you know, whether you made poor decisions or whether you were violated, for example. If that's your framework, I think the imperative for people who are trying to communicate with people on this issue and try to persuade them is to meet them where the values are, and not, like, one of the things that I would not want people to draw as a recommendation based on all the data that I just walked through is this idea that if you encounter somebody in the wild who says that they're pro-life, my recommended approach is not to say, well, actually, you're not, because I have all this data here that shows that, you know, the position that you hold and all of these values that are, you know, playing upon it are actually wrong in your head and you don't know yourself, right? So if I were to encounter somebody in the wild in my personal life that I wanted to persuade to my position because they told me that their convictions and principles led them to identify as pro-life, I would probably respond with something like, I actually think your values and mine line up really well on this. I think if our friend was pregnant and had a miscarriage, I think both of us would want her to get the best medical care to resolve that miscarriage and not end up dead or unable to have kids in the future. And that's actually what I think is on the line here. So essential to hit the values and hit those symbols rather than draw the conclusion that symbolic politics means we can argue facts against those symbols to try to convince somebody to be more rational than they're being. That is not a recommended approach here.
So the other version of this that I've been hearing in interviews with some electeds is almost like a don't bother kind of approach of like, well, we're going to work back from the result of this election that there is in fact some sort of mandate on various issues. And so we're not going to get drawn in. You know, they use all sorts of metaphors, right? Like it's, we're not going to get distracted. We're not going to get lured into an ambush. We're not, you know, whatever. Everybody's got their little metaphors for these things. But it's kind of a don't have the argument at all, right? If I can't meet your emotional symbolic framing with, well, actually, you know, the truth is you say that you're pro-life, but actually, if I can't meet it with that, then there's no point actually in having the conversation. And look, if they voted for Trump or whatever, then I can work back from their candidate selection what their policy preferences are. And like, look, this is true in almost every category I work in. Most of people's loyalties to brands are habits, not loyalties, right? So they don't spend there are a lot of people who drink Coke and would never drink Pepsi, but have never tasted Pepsi, right? They don't have an opinion about Pepsi, really. It's just that, like, their mom always bought Coke, and so that's what they buy, and they like it. So why why drink anything else? Like, at a certain point, people just satisfies. Like, it's good enough. I like it. I'll like it. I'll buy it. There's a marketing science guy, Byron Sharp, who talks about you don't buy what you like what you buy. But I think one of the things that's interesting about that temptation, and also the interpretation of some of this type of data, I think, to feel like, okay, so now I have to explain abortion to you so that I can get your actual point of view about it. No, that's literally not what you just modeled. What you just modeled was, if our friend needed this care, I think we'd both want her to get the best possible care and preserve her fertility and save her life and whatever. As opposed to, well, okay, let me step you through all of the majority reasons that people get abortions, and let's go down the list and see which ones you really like. Right. Like that's fine for a diagnostic to figure out people's real preferences, but in communication, you would not want to reinstantiate the questionnaire at them as a messaging strategy. And I wonder about why you think political strategists, political communicators get kind of wrapped around this axle of, like, I'm either agreeing with you or I'm explaining to you, as opposed to I'm trying to meet you where your actual values are. I mean, I guess maybe that's just the question. Why do you think we have this information? You could go like one extra minute of sense making and figure out how to communicate it. And instead, we don't seem to want to do that right now. We seem to want to say, like, that's a distraction. If we're explaining you're losing, just move on. There's a mandate, move on. There's a mandate, move on. It seems like there's another set of options.
I would say so. I would say so, especially because I think the mandate concept is really overstated. I mean, this was a close election that Donald Trump won by a point. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure why that needs to translate into the notion of an overwhelming mandate or a referendum on an incredibly popular issue, right? Mm-hmm. Like that other half of the country that voted for Harris in exit polling and in all of our post-election polling continues to name abortion as a really important issue. Mm-hmm. And he lost by a point. Or he won by a point, excuse me, wishful Freudian slip there. If we had lost by 10 or 15, different story. Right. Suggests needing to go back to the drawing board to figure out how we communicate on an issue. Mm-hmm. I think another piece of this that I'm just personally on a hobby horse about is because we're kind of in the wilderness and in this existential moment about what is the Democratic Party for, what are progressives for, what are we doing with our political power and project. I think part of our purpose is championing a pro-social agenda. Mm-hmm. And I think that if polling suggests that an aspect of your pro-social agenda is not where you want it to be in terms of public opinion, you have more than one choice. You can turn away from the topic and wait for it to organically arrive where you want it to be, and then weigh in as soon as it's popular. Or you can harness all of your political power and work to make it more popular. And that has everything to do with communicating around values rather than data, because public opinion often filters down rather than up. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it's filtering in both directions. The public is already there. Mm-hmm. I think what they're looking for from elected officials, when I speak to people who care about this issue, is some fight and some reflection of the fact that this is popular and that this is something that people want.
Shockingly, that does not seem to be the default for a lot of folks. I mean, I think the other thing that's interesting is this ability to use polling to talk themselves almost into any response they want, as long as it's not that one. But the other thing that I think came up in this past election was the number of kind of, not exactly split ticket, but sometimes sort of split ticket voting, where you would go in Arizona and vote to preserve abortion rights in Arizona, but vote for Trump also. And this, I think, sent some sort of signal to people that, like, either the populace had sort of conformed to the Trumpian line of we're going to send it back to the states and it's going to be great. And so that was the accepted position. Now that you could have it both ways. You could vote for Trump on whatever your other political priorities were, your other identity priorities were, and also protect abortion rights in your state because, that's where you have some greater sense of control or influence or something like that, or where you're actually getting to vote on it, for one thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of got triangulated into, well, he won a not majority of the vote and also by 1 point, and simultaneously people voted to protect abortion in just about every state that had a measure on the ballot about it. So therefore, abortion is not a salient issue and we don't need to talk about it. Like, it became important but not salient, right? It's not salient to electing the president. And now that it's been thrown back to the states, well, people will vote the way that they vote, and we don't really have to worry about this abortion thing anymore. Because, right. And this I think is just related to, and honestly, this is not different on the commercial side of research. The conversations I have with clients that are like, you cannot just chase customers to figure out what products to make and how to market to them. They cannot tell you this. And so you have to take a stand on something and see what happens and then learn from that experiment. But not also take every experiment as a win or a failure, as opposed to an opportunity to learn what to do next. And I think this is also something I see as an observer of political actors and strategists of every time it doesn't work in the short term, it's seen as a loser. And so drop it like it's hot and move on to something else. But also this kind of trying to triangulate at public opinion through things like electoral outcomes, who did they vote for, and then also these not deep, multi-step, multi-layer interrogations of particular topics. And I feel like we're seeing this right now on immigration. You hear from electeds all the time that clearly the American people are with Trump on immigration. And I'm I don't know, I'm reading all these newspaper articles where people are shocked to find out who's getting deported, who's getting their visa revoked, who's getting picked up on the street and rendered to foreign prisons. I don't know that they are with Trump on his immigration policy. In polling, do you think immigration should be more restricted? Do you think fewer immigrants should come into the country? Who do you trust more on immigration? At that level of the question, yes, you get some sense of popular support for Trump on this. But I think then it seems like a question worth going into on the same level of detail that you tackled in that January poll for abortion as well, of well, let's talk about specific circumstances here. Do you think the people should be deported because they wrote an op-ed in the school paper?
Right. It's funny that you say that, actually, because we did exactly that. We Change Research, we put out a piece on exactly this topic, starting with that, somewhat surface level question from which we build. Mm-hmm. Of whether you support or oppose Trump's mass deportation policy. And then once you start to ask people about specific groups of people and asking whether they should be deported or allowed to stay in the country, the groups that he's going after, most people think should be allowed to stay because they have TPS, for example. Mm-hmm. They legally sought political asylum and they are waiting for their case to get processed, or they are undocumented, but they've been in the country for 10 to 15 years. They pay taxes. They're married to citizens. They have jobs. They have clean mm-hmm. criminal records. The vast majority of people do not want to see those people deported. And that's who he's going after. Mm-hmm. So it's a perfect example of why we have to dig a little bit below the surface, and then why we have to make sure that we are talking about these issues, not in terms of facts and figures. We never want to well actually people. Mm-hmm. We never want to well actually our way into a conversation.
No.
But the values are there. And when you get into the specifics of who these policies harm, voters are not on board with this.
Right. So I guess I have kind of two questions as we start to close. One is, I have been kicking around an idea for a little while of because frequently when we kick off a project with our clients, they will have already conducted some level of survey or have some tracking data or something like that. And they will hand it to us and we will take a look at it and go, okay, so here's what we can say we know. here's what I think you've read, but you didn't read it in, in relationship to some of these other answers. And maybe if you read them in relationship to these other answers, instead of taking them one by one, a bit more of a narrative would appear here to you. And here's what it looks like that narrative is. And then obviously the other thing we often find is like, oh, there's like a giant field of questions that you haven't asked yet. And maybe that would help illuminate why these things don't feel useful to you, which is great for us. Obviously, we can sell more research. But I think the thing I keep thinking about is just like, I think a lot of consumers of polling data are not good at reading polling data, and they are not really given a lot of tools with which to do that. I am going to take a point of privilege here. You do not have to join me on this, but that Blue Rose Strategies deck that got circulated the other week, like that thing I referred to, I told my partner Paul, I was like, is this like the mumblecore of research? This is the most impenetrable set of slides I have ever seen, and I have been in this industry for 20 plus years. I don't know how to read them, and I do this for a living. Clearly, there is like 70 extra pages that are not in what got released publicly that hopefully make sense to somebody. And also, clearly, there is some stakeholder who wanted them to ask about AI. But that comes out of left field as you are like flicking through this deck, trying to figure out what they're trying to say. So I will also stipulate that sometimes these decks are terrible and you shouldn't expect ordinary people to be able to read them. But if you're a consumer of polling, like the stuff that you're referencing in these pieces and that Change is doing, how does that alter the way that you receive research? How should you be reading these polls when you see them? Because I think a lot of times it sounds to me, at least in the way that they talk about it publicly, like it's very surface level processing and not a lot of thinking about it or sense making that's going into it. So for like customers of research, what should they be doing in order to frankly ask better questions of the research and do a deeper sense making exercise with it?
I think that's the perfect place to start, is essentially you're consuming some polling data. What questions has it not answered for you on this topic? I think most of us, as we process polling results, when they are written in sort of a narrative prose form rather than a super dense 70 slide deck, which is not how most of us consume it, right? Most of us are reading a short article or a short blurb. Right. What questions are unanswered for you based on what they have reported? Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good place to start in terms of appreciating what that polling question did tell us, because it is useful. We do need that information. But what has it left on the table? And I think when it comes to conducting public opinion research and in terms of interpreting it, my recommendation is always to consider what's below the surface, because symbolic beliefs frequently do not line up perfectly with people's issue positions, and that can operate in both directions. So sometimes the symbolic position is a really high-minded moral or belief, something like racism is bad, we should all have equal opportunities no matter our skin color or background. And then people's actual attitudes on policies that might help enact that reality, like for example, affirmative action, pulls way below a moral statement about how racism is bad. So other times the symbolic position is the thing we're trying to counter. That's like the pro-life example, right? They're asserting a symbolic belief, and then underneath it, their issue positions don't match. Their issue positions are closer to where we want them to be. So I think it's just really important to be mindful always of how symbolic politics influences people's beliefs and behaviors, and appreciate that sometimes the symbol is something that we are trying to rally people around, and sometimes the symbol is something that we're a little bit trying to counteract, but we still need to do that through values-centric communication. So whether you are consuming the public opinion research or conducting it, consider what's below the surface, consider the symbols, and ask yourself, what hasn't this answered for me? That is where you would probably want to go digging next.
Mm-hmm. And then going back to, the examples you gave at the beginning of getting those clearly Republican candidate polls, the thing I think about when I see those types of questions is they are, in a sense, testing messaging. Right. They're trying to see if I phrase it this way, does it get this kind of result? If I phrase it that way, I don't want to say it's a push pull. It's not a push pull, but they're kind of playing with framings to see, like, if we talk about it as border security, then yes, all of a sudden people kind of tilt right. I don't know if I tilted right on the screen. I tilted left in real life, but anyway, they tilt in any event. When you start talking about people with temporary protected status, or people who are married to U.S. citizens, or have children, or have been in the country for 30 years, or were brought here as children and have never lived anywhere else, all of a sudden it tilts you in a different direction. I'm curious about that kind of, the value of asking the question that way to figure out how do I kind of get the result I want? How do I rally you to my side? Because I'm using, frankly, border security is actually emotionally resonant language. It sparks fear, right? We have to have border security. We can't just let the hordes come in across the border. Like, there's some sort of, probably very ancient instinct to be protective in this way. But maybe you can just sort of talk about why do we poll in this way, of kind of using the poll itself as a message testing approach? And am I wrong? Is that what they're actually doing, or are they genuinely thinking that this is how people think about the topic and trying to figure out how popular it is?
It's a great question. I would say we at Change, at least, are really mindful of different sections of a poll and what they are meant to do, because we are always striving to accurately represent public opinion. And at the same time, we are often enlisted to do research projects to help clients refine and develop a communication strategy on an issue in which they are casting the issue with a certain frame and advocating for a certain outcome. So the important thing to distinguish within a poll is where are you measuring and where are you trying to move? Because they're different. So I would say in places where what you're trying to do is measure, you want to be really mindful of your language and ensure that you have, again, answer options that match how people organically talk about and think about issues. That might mean, for example, in a top issue battery, that abortion shows up more than once. It might say something about restricting or limiting abortions. It also might have a separate answer item for protecting access to legal abortion in our state. And that would allow people to self-select their position on abortion, not just indicating salience, but salience in which direction. So when you're measuring, you really want to make sure that you are giving people accurate to their experience and position, accurate choices. Then once you transition into a message section, that's where you have a lot more freedom to cast it in the light that you want to cast it. In addition to testing how oppo messaging lands, right? Is one of these frames more effective than the other? One of the things that we like to do is, try something a little bit more creative with message testing. So sometimes what we'll do is give people pairs of messages on two different sides of the same coin, right? We should do this or we shouldn't do this, or here's why this is a good idea, here's why this is a bad idea. And we can ask people not just to rate each message individually, but then rate which one they find more compelling. And then if you want to take it a step further, we can also A/B test which version goes up against which version. And that can help us answer a question of not only 66% find our message very convincing, but 60% choose our message over the oppo message when we use this frame and not when we use this frame, which can help us really refine how we talk about and frame a topic in kind of a real world simulation where people are hearing competing arguments and trying to decide where they fall on which side of the fence. So are you measuring or are you moving or are you attempting to move? I think it depends on what part of the poll you're working on. But depending on which section you're in, you really need to moderate your language appropriate to that section and to that goal of that part of the poll.
I think that's a super useful suggestion here. And I think the other thing that that comes to mind is just the need to do that measuring, understanding, listening stuff as much as possible so that when you do your A/B test, you are testing meaningful things. Because I think, there was also, throughout the campaign, Blueprint was doing their conjoint analysis of 25 different messages and concluding that because these got a 0.3% higher response on them, that therefore this was what we should dump all the money into. And I'll reserve that for another conversation. Like, conjoint is fine. It's not, I got really, again, research nerds should not be allowed to watch interviews with other research nerds because, like, one of the guys from Blueprint was on an interview going like, well, we do this really interesting methodology called conjoint. And I was like, okay, um, I have a ton of clients who ask to do conjoint, and frequently we're like, but you only have three things to test.
Yeah.
Why are we doing conjoint? And then also like when it's that close, like, and then the other problem, of course, is what are you choosing to test? So if you're putting into the hopper like 12 messages that are all like, uplifting biography messages and another 10 messages that are all about how you're going to help the economy. And then you only test a handful of messages that are maybe not super well crafted to people's actual positions on or values around topics like abortion or immigration or gun control or any of these kinds of, social issues that people are very emotional about. Then you wind up getting kind of normative responses that are like, well, those are positive, so I like them. And like, I like the one that doesn't make me feel bad. And that is something we see all the time as well in message testing. And even in like, I was saying this the other day about channel planning, like, does advertising persuade you? No, I'm not a chump. But like in context, I saw this ad and it really made me think about this thing. And that's the reality of people is you've got to get underneath the layers. And so I'm really glad that you walked us through this approach to doing things. I'm glad that you use this approach in your work at Change Research. I'm glad somebody's doing that. What advice would you give to people trying to make sense of people's opinions in this weird whirling moment that we're in right now? What would you like to see change about how other pollsters approach understanding public opinion given all the chaos?
I'm probably a broken record here at this point, but I would say consider symbolic politics, center symbolic politics. That is my general lens. So of course it's one that I advocate to other people, but I think it's an evidence-based position that I'm pushing for. If you start and stop at the symbolic level, you don't learn what you need to learn. I think we need to always be mindful of the ways that symbols are either operating somewhat to our disadvantage in ways that we can still circumvent, right, with values-oriented messaging to try to align as much as possible with that symbol while also moving people around on an issue. And also be really cognizant of where we have a symbolic position at our backs rather than as a headwind. Ultimately, and I'm not alone in suggesting this, values-oriented communication, providing context, telling stories is always going to be more effective than data when trying to win an argument. That is a very frustrating reality sometimes for people in data-driven professions, right? Like knowing everything that you know now about how the public feels about abortion, even when we get into the nitty-gritty. The notion of somebody saying that this is a polarizing issue or that America is closely divided, that drives me a little bit crazy every time I hear it. And I always have to fight the urge to be like, look at my poll and remember that, to practice what I preach, which is we have to tell stories. We have to center the values. We have to figure out a way that we plug in. And also, I would encourage, personally, political elites, people with the power to shape public opinion, to do that and to sort of assert their values paradigm and point out where we all have this in common. Right? So you're talking to that person in your personal life who says that they're pro-life. Choose a person that you know in common and tell a story around them. Try to make it personal and assert in that process that your values align. Your values are actually exactly in the same place on this issue. The recommendation is not necessarily to say you have this value and I have this value and both of us are, bringing our values to bear. So we should both we should duke it out to see which value wins, align with the stated value, and do it to tell a story of what you think needs to happen.
Yeah, I think this is often good advice for persuasion in general. And in guy I know, David McCraney, has written a lot about, persuading people away from odd beliefs and that a lot of it is trying to find that shared values ground and build from that as opposed to trying to like take it from the argument and deconstruct it. And so I think that's really sound advice for communicators and also for people who are trying to understand an issue more deeply. So Lauren, thank you so much for taking the time and being patient while I dealt with my technical problems at the beginning of this. And I hope we can talk about other things that you work on as you continue to publish on your Substack. And can you remind folks what the name of the Substack is and where they can find you to follow your work?
Yes, absolutely. The newsletter is called Mind the Gap. You can find it on Substack. And if you're interested in conducting any public opinion research or exploring some of the work that we've done at Change Research, come check us out at our website.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farrah Bostic. Production by The Difference Engine. Editing by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter at crosstabspod.substack.com or visit our show page at crosstabspodcast.com. We are now on Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram as CrosstabsPod, where we share links to new episodes and newsletters. We hope you'll follow us on your favorite platform, tell your friends about the show, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast service. If you want to learn more about what I do, you can find me on all the socials at Farrah Bostic or get in touch through thedifferenceengine.co. See you next time.